So the known details so far are that the Tejas crash happened on November 21st, 2025 at the Dubai Air Show. It was during a demonstration flight at Al Maktoum International Airport. Sadly, the pilot, Wing Commander Naman Sayal, did not survive. Right now, the Indian Air Force is conducting an inquiry to figure out exactly what went wrong, but those are the main facts we have at this point. As of now, the Tejas has had two notable crashes. One was in 2024, where thankfully the pilot survived, and the second is this recent one in 2025 at the Dubai Air Show. In the 2024 crash, the cause was eventually attributed to a technical malfunction. Yes, in the 2024 accident, the root cause was indeed identified as an oil pump failure. That mechanical issue led to a loss of engine lubrication, which then caused the engine to seize up mid-flight. That in turn resulted in the pilot having to eject. The Tejas is a light combat aircraft developed by India and is designed to be a multi-role fighter. In terms of specifications, it's got a single engine and a delta wing configuration, which gives it a pretty good agility and speed. It's capable of both air-to-air and air-to-ground missions. Typically, it can reach speeds of around Mach 1.8, and it has a range of roughly 3,000 kilometers with external fuel tanks. It's also equipped with modern avionics and can carry a variety of weapons, including missiles and bombs. Right now, the Indian Air Force has about 44 Tejas jets in total, 38 of the standard Mach 1 version and 6 trainer variants. They've also ordered another 83 of the upgraded Mach 1A version with delivery starting next year. Let's dig into what we know about the Dubai crash scenario. During the Dubai Air Show, the Tejas was performing a routine aerobatic maneuver when things went wrong. Shortly after that, it seems the aircraft started to descend rapidly and couldn't recover. But of course, the full investigation is still underway, so these are just the initial insights. We'll know more once they release the final report. A negative G maneuver is basically when the aircraft is maneuvering in such a way that the occupants feel a force opposite to the normal pull of gravity. In other words, instead of feeling pushed down into their seats, the pilot and anything inside the cockpit will feel like they're being lifted up, almost like a brief sense of weightlessness or even being pushed toward the canopy. Pilots sometimes perform negative G maneuvers for certain aerobatic sequences, but they can be quite stressful on both the aircraft and the human body because they're not the usual direction of force we experience. They can also lead to issues if not managed carefully, and especially with fuel systems or control surfaces. So if the Tejas was indeed doing a negative G maneuver, that could definitely add another layer of complexity to what might have gone wrong. Essentially, a negative G maneuver often involves the aircraft either being inverted or at least in a flight attitude where the lift and the forces are acting in the opposite direction from normal. So yeah, it's that situation where the aircraft is either flying upside down or creating that inverted kind of force on the pilot and the plane. Different aircraft definitely have different constraints and limitations when it comes to negative G maneuvers. It really depends on the design of the aircraft, its structural limits, and the way its systems are built. So for the Tejas, we know it can handle up to about positive 9G in terms of pulling force. But when it comes to negative G limits, the exact numbers aren't really publicly detailed. Generally, though, it's designed to handle a reasonable amount of negative G, just not as extreme as the positive G limits. Being a similar lightweight fighter aircraft, we can get a ballpark idea. For example, jets like the F-16 or the Gripen, which are also agile fighters, typically have a negative G limit in the range of about negative 3 to negative 3.5 G. So while we don't have the exact number for the Tejas, it's likely in a similar ballpark, maybe around that negative 3G range. That gives you a general sense of what comparable aircraft can handle. When an aircraft is in a negative G maneuver, the systems and structure are under a kind of stress that they aren't usually designed for in normal flight. If you exceed that limit, it can make it harder for the aircraft to recover smoothly because you might be pushing it beyond what its systems can handle safely. In other words, if you stay within the negative G limits, the aircraft can more reliably transition back to normal flight. If you exceed those limits, you might run into issues that make recovery more difficult or put more strain on the aircraft structure and controls. So those limits are kind of a safety boundary to help ensure that the aircraft can recover properly. When we talk about recovering from a negative G maneuver, we basically mean bringing the aircraft back to a normally stable flight attitude. So if it's been inverted or it's been under negative G forces, recovering means railing it back upright and getting it back under positive G and stable control. And yes, it can definitely happen that an aircraft is unable to pull out or recover if it goes beyond its limits. If the stress is too high or if the control surfaces can't respond properly because they're outside their safe range, the pilot may find it really hard or even impossible to bring the aircraft back to normal flight. That's why staying within those G limits is so important. It keeps everything in a range where the aircraft can safely recover and avoid a situation where it can't pull out at all. Safety margins are super important, especially when you're doing something like a negative G maneuver. In terms of altitude, you definitely want to have a good buffer of height so that if anything goes wrong or if the recovery takes a bit longer, you have room to maneuver. A common rule of thumb for aerobatic or unusual attitude maneuvers is to have at least a few thousand feet of altitude. For example, military pilots often have altitude minimums that require them to start these kinds of maneuvers at several thousand feet above the ground. Maybe something like 5,000 or even 10,000 feet, depending on the complexity. That way, if the aircraft takes a little longer to recover or if something unexpected happens, the pilot has that altitude safety margin to regain control. So in short, the safety margin in terms of altitude is really about having enough height to ensure a safe recovery. And usually that means starting these maneuvers at a pretty comfortable altitude above the ground. If we're talking about the absolute bare minimum altitude where a pilot is essentially not giving themselves any safety margin, is basically the lowest altitude from which the aircraft could still recover from that maneuver in an ideal scenario. But that is extremely risky. It means there's almost no room for error and no buffer if anything goes even slightly wrong. So while you could technically recover from a negative G maneuver at a very low altitude in a perfect world, it's definitely not recommended because you have zero safety net. In reality, pilots are always trained to keep a healthy altitude margin for exactly that reason. Given the Tejas' speed and the nature of a negative G maneuver, you'd realistically want at least a few thousand feet as a bare minimum. Something like 2,000 to 3,000 feet would be a lot more reasonable as a lower boundary if you really didn't want to have any extra safety margin. In other words, you want at least a couple thousand feet of altitude, even in a minimal scenario, just to give yourself enough room to recover safely and avoid any ground collision risk. So yeah, definitely more than just a few hundred feet. If the aircraft was leveling out but still losing lift and ended up impacting the ground, then altitude is definitely one piece of the puzzle, but there could be other factors too. Engine performance is a possibility. For example, if the engine wasn't providing full thrust during the recovery, maybe because of a temporary power loss or a delay in throttle response, that could have made it harder to gain altitude quickly. Another factor could be aerodynamic, like if the aircraft was still in a nose low attitude and just didn't have enough lift or speed to climb out in time. Could also be related to control inputs, like maybe the control surfaces didn't respond as quickly as needed, or there was some aerodynamic lag. So yeah, it's definitely possible that in addition to the low altitude, there was something going on with the engine or the aerodynamics that made it hard for the aircraft to recover fully. Let me sum it all up. So if we're looking at the possible scenarios for how this accident might have unfolded, we have a few key points. First, there's the altitude factor. It seemed the aircraft was performing the negative G maneuver at a relatively low altitude, which reduced the margin for a safe recovery. Ideally, a higher altitude would have given more room to pull out of the maneuver. Second, there could have been engine or thrust-related issues. If the engine wasn't delivering full power or there was any delay in throttle response, that could have made it harder to gain altitude quickly enough. Third, we might consider aerodynamic or control factors. It's possible the aircraft's control surfaces didn't respond as quickly, or that the plane was still in a nose-low attitude, losing lift and unable to climb in time. In summary, the accident likely involved a combination of low altitude reducing recovery margin and possibly some engine or control response factors that made it harder to pull out of the maneuver. Each of these elements would have contributed to the final outcome. Generally speaking, no, it's not normal practice for pilots to just ignore safety margins, especially in something as high stakes as an airshow. Airshow pilots are typically very well trained and aware of the safety margins they need to maintain. They usually plan their routines with altitude buffers in mind so that they have room to recover safely if anything goes wrong. That said, sometimes in the heat of a performance or due to external pressures, pilots might push the limits more than usual, but it's definitely not standard or considered a safe practice. Safety margins are there for a reason, and professional pilots are trained to respect them to keep themselves and the audience safe. As for why that might happen, there are a few possible reasons. Sometimes in high-stakes events like an international air show, there's a lot of pressure to deliver a really impressive performance. Pilots might feel the need to stay low for the crowd or for visibility reasons. There's also the possibility of just human factors, like maybe the pilot misjudged the altitude or was under pressure to complete a maneuver within a certain space. But it's important to remember that these are just possibilities. We can't know exactly what was going on in the pilot's mind, but yes, the combination of the event's high profile and the desire to put on a good show could definitely lead to a situation where safety margins get a little tighter than they ideally should be. Once the full investigation is done, they'll have detailed recommendations. But from everything we've talked about, I think the prime safety recommendation would really be to maintain those altitude safety margins. In other words, always plan these maneuvers with enough altitude buffer so that if something unexpected happens, there's room to recover. Another recommendation would be to reinforce strict adherence to safety protocols and maybe even have some extra oversight during air shows to make sure pilots don't feel pressure to cut those corners. And of course, just ongoing training and emphasis on mismanagement so that pilots always keep safety as a top priority. So yeah, keeping that altitude margin in mind would be a key takeaway.